Okay, I'm going to just break from the usual routine here of jumping from question to question, and I would welcome what I'm about to say. I would welcome questions on it from the audience. So think about that as you hear this. News is just coming through that Britain's first Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, has died. There'll be a full report on this on Late Line programme after Q&A or on News Radio, if you happen to be listening to News Radio. But we have been talking about women leaders. We're talking indeed about Margaret Thatcher.
And me with no champagne.
Now, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Now, Elvis Costello once wrote a song saying that he would stamp the dirt down on her grave. But I think time has passed now, and people have a slightly different view of Margaret Thatcher. Do you think that's true or not?
I do think it's true. I mean, we have to remember as well that when Richard Nixon died in the United States, people had an enormously different view of him. He went away post-Watergate, came back tan, rested and ready as an elder statesman. And certainly Margaret Thatcher did that extremely effectively. But she sort of transcended what the policies of her day were to become iconic, either as a figure of hate for the left or a figure of reverence for the right. In a way, both are really, really valuable because they light a fire under people's aspirations, whether you agree with her or disagree with her. Having that focus, it's probably an incredibly stressful place to be as an individual, though. And again, going back to this notion that no one person can really embody the hopes of the entire group of people that they're supposedly representing. To be honest, going and looking and seeing what has changed post-Thatcher in terms of representation of women as MPs in the UK Parliament, it's improved, but not by a whole lot. And I suppose the hope really here is that post-Julia Gillard, more and more women will enter politics, but Britain didn't manage to do it. So here's hoping Australia does.
I think I might have misspoken earlier. I said first Prime Minister. Of course, I mean first female Prime Minister of Britain. Janet Albrechtsen, your thoughts on the loss of Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I think it's a sad moment, and I think Margaret Thatcher will be remembered for not only being the first female Prime Minister of Britain, but one of those rare politicians that has a series of convictions, whether you agree with them or not. I mean, what I find most offensive about many modern-day politicians is that there's just, they don't really believe in anything. I'd much rather see, you know, a politician on the left who sincerely believes in a set of convictions than this sort of whatever-it-takes attitude that has set in on both the left and the right. And I admired Margaret Thatcher's convictions. I happen to agree with many of them, not all of them, but many of them. You know, occasionally when a country hits rock bottom, you really need a strong individual like Margaret Thatcher to make the really, really tough decisions. And she did that. You know, there were strikes, there were bodies heaped up in the streets because, you know, there were just strikes all over the place. And Margaret Thatcher was one of those people who believed in what she did. She came in and said, and she took on the unions. And she transformed what was a very backward economy into a far more open economy. And that is not an easy thing to do, and it's certainly not an easy thing for a woman to have done it when she did it.
OK, we've got a question from the audience there.
I sense that the public is increasingly frustrated, disillusioned and embarrassed by politicians and with the political process.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. We're talking about Margaret Thatcher here for a moment, so if you have a question about Margaret Thatcher, please...
It leads on to the political base.
OK, go ahead.
My question is, then, how can women combat this situation and return politics to the original principle of service to the community based on values of excellence, honesty, accountability and transparency for the common good?
OK, I'll throw it to Germaine Greer. If you want to reflect on that in terms of Margaret Thatcher, I'd just like to get your thoughts about Margaret Thatcher before we move on to other questions.
Well, Margaret Thatcher certainly is probably the most influential British politician in my lifetime. But the important thing to understand is the party she influenced was the Labour Party, who learnt her policies and applied them. And she also imbibed quite a lot from the Australian system, where you turn your working class into stakeholders and get them to live out a life of debt and DIY, which keeps them out of trouble and off the streets. So Mrs Thatcher imbibed all of that and applied it in her own way. So we had the sell-off of council housing. Now, of course, we have a huge housing shortage, etc., and so on. But people mustn't forget two important things. One is the sinking of the Belgrano, which is a war crime, which she strangely got away with. And the other thing is the Al-Yamama arms deal. which was connected with the BOAC bribery business that was suppressed and so on. The massive corruption. Now that she has completed her days, and she's been very much reduced recently, I saw her quite often, and she was still doing all the traditional things that she always did, using the same language and so on, but never quite knowing where she was. But now that she's no longer a problem, in that we can start to actually investigate what happened with the Al Umama arms deal and why it is that her son, who's an idiot, is actually a multi-millionaire. These are all things we've got to work out. There's a good deal of reassessment to be done in the case of Margaret Thatcher.
And very briefly, did you admire her as a woman? She basically climbed the highest porticos of power in Britain, and that was no mean feat.
Well, but you have to understand how it was done. There were no women around her. She was actually elected by her own party to serve as a new broom that would bring about reforms that would be very unpopular. Then they figured they could unload her and start again. When they actually came to unload her, it was done in the most callous way. And now Tony Blair, who's her most famous disciple, is a multi-millionaire, probably a billionaire. Margaret Thatcher didn't get any seats on any lucrative boards. None of the easy money came her way. She actually did lecture tours, which is outrageous that someone of her political eminence should be reduced to that. Believe me, the British establishment got their revenge on Margaret Thatcher.
And we have one more question down the front. You have your hand up there.
Margaret Thatcher came from a relatively elite background, and do you think it would have been different if she was...
Shopkeeper's daughter and
No,
grandson.
she didn't. That's wrong.
That's awkward. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, we will move along now. We'll go to other questions.